Okay, so welcome to the next round of public talk, which is a part of Global Minds for Ukraine initiative, which brings here world's most famous intellectuals to speak to Ukrainian students and the public. I know we have the issue with blackouts in Kiev and other places, so this will be recorded and you'll have a chance to watch it later. I am Maxim Abrizan. I'm associate professor at Kiev School of Economics and also secretariat researcher at WHO Economics Council. And it is a great honor and a privilege for me and for all us to welcome here Thomas Piketty, who is a professor at Paris School of Economics, London School of Economics, co-director of World Inequality and World Inequality Lab and World Inequality Database, and of course, a very well-known best-selling author. And today he will talk about his new book, which has been just recently released, A Brief History of Equality. So let us give a warm welcome to Professor Thomas Piketty, and let's watch this very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Maxime, for your invitation. And so let me try to share my screen. I'm going to use this presentation. Please, let me know if this is yes, this is okay. You can see it?
Yeah, we can see it. Yes, we can see it. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so let me start right away. This is of course, these are very unusual circumstances, and I'm very moved and happy to be here with you today. I'm going to talk about a book which is in a way surprisingly optimistic in its view of the long run. And I think it's not that I believe everything will always work as planned and will always go in the right direction, but I think it's important, especially in this very special time in which we are today, and particularly in Ukraine, to try to take this very long-run perspective on economic history, and in particular, what I want to say in this presentation and this work is that, in the long run, we've made collectively a lot of progress in the direction of more economic prosperity and also more social and economic equality. And these two long-run movements have come together. So, more equality has been absolutely critical for the rise of modern economic prosperity. And, of course, the big lesson is that we could and we should continue in this direction. And so, this is this very simple message that I try to describe in this book, A Brief History of Equality, which I would like, to summarize some of the main arguments with you. And, then I'd be very happy to answer questions. So I'm going to talk about this long-run perspective and sort of optimistic perspective for the long run. But first, what I'm going to do before focusing on this book, A Brief History of Equality, I'm going to give you a few results about sort of the big picture of inequality in the world today, taking a number of results from the World Inequality Report 2022, which is a report that we published at the World Inequality Lab in Paris. So we are based in Paris, but we are using an international network of over 100 researchers from all over the world, and so you will find easily this report online. And I'm going to summarize some of the main findings. So this World Inequality Report is a report that we publish every 4 years. The first one was in 2018, where we sort of summarize what we have learned about inequality from this database, the World Inequality Database, which is a sort of very ambitious database on the historical evolution of inequality, both between countries and within countries. So we started with income inequality, and then in particular in the World Inequality Report 2022, there are three main innovations as compared to the initial focus on income inequality, which is that we now cover wealth inequality. We we also provide some new global measures of gender inequality, and we also provide new indicators of environmental inequality in carbon emissions. So we started from income, we moved to wealth, gender, environmental inequality, and I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of some of our findings, right away. So you can go on the website, and you will find much more detailed data. Let me start with the sort of the simplest case, but in a way this is sort of the basis of our work, which is inequality of income. So here you have, so on this map, you have a simple indicator, which is the share of total national income going to the top 10%. So let's familiarize ourselves with the orders of magnitude. It's always important to be clear about the orders of magnitude. So we are talking about 10% of the population. So if you had complete equality, they should have 10% of total income. If you had complete inequality, they should have 100%. So of course, in practice, it's always between 10 and 100. What I want to stress here is that it varies a lot. So not quite from 10 to 100, but it varies from, say, 20 to almost 70. So, if you take some countries in Europe, in particular in Nordic Europe, you will have 25%, 25 to 30% of total income going to the top 10. If you take South Africa, you get almost 70%. If you take Brazil or Mexico or Chile, you get 65%. So, it varies quite a lot over time. It is across the world. So these are the latest data for today. It varies also a lot over time. So, if you take the rich countries today, the richest countries in the world today, in Western Europe, and to a lesser extent in North America or Japan, they tend to be more equal than countries, in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, etc. But it's not always been like that. So if you take Western Europe a century ago, it will not be quite like South Africa today, but it will be close to Latin America today. So you will get, between 50 and 60% of total income for the top 10%, as opposed to 25, 30% today. So, Europe has not always been equal, and, it became more equal over the course of the 20th century, partly due to catastrophic shocks like World War I, World War II, but most importantly, by the development of new institutions, the welfare state, social security, progressive taxation, and this is what has transformed, some countries by becoming more equal, and at the same time becoming more prosperous through more investment in education, etc. So this is for the top 10% share. If you look at the share going to the bottom 50%, this is sort of the reverse side, where you also have the, whatever doesn't go to the top 10 or bottom 50 goes to the sort of 40% who are in between the top 10 and the bottom 50, which you can call the middle class or upper middle class if you want. Now, look at the bottom 50%, again, if you had complete equality, the bottom 50% should have 50% of total income. If you had complete inequality, they should have 0. In practice, it goes from 5 to almost 30%. So again, the most equal country would be in Nordic Europe. You would have 25%. In South Africa, you would have 5%. In Latin America, you would have between 5 and 10%. Although there are important variations. If you take Argentina, which has historically has developed something closer to a European-type welfare state under Peronism, you have actually a significantly higher bottom 50% shares than in Brazil or Mexico or Chile. So, there's no deterministic reason why some part of the world should be equal or unequal. And I want to stress that because, in my book, I stress a lot, for instance, the example of Sweden, which today we look as very equal, but in fact, a century ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was one of the most unequal countries in Europe and in the world, with an incredibly unequal political system where, it's not only that the right to vote was restricted to the richest individuals, but it's also that within the top 20% of male voters that had the right to vote, you could have between 1 and 100 votes, depending on how wealthy you are. And in municipal election, there was no upper ceiling, so a single individual could have more than 50% of the vote on its own, and even corporations had the right to vote in municipal election, which is something that even multinational corporations today would like to have in the countries where they invest, but they don't even dare asking for it. So sometimes they find other ways to get the same outcome, but at least they don't dare. So in a way, Sweden was the most corrupt country on earth, or at least the country with the strongest concentration of political power associated to money a century ago. And then it became, Sweden through mobilization of the trade union, the Social Democratic Party, which took power in 1932 and completely transformed the institution of the country and put the state capacity of Sweden to the service of a completely different project. So, I think it's very important to realize that there's no deterministic reason why a particular country should be equal or unequal. So going back to the order of magnitude for the bottom 50% share, you can see that, when you are the bottom 50% and you have 25% of total income, it means that on average, your average income is about half of the average income of the total population. So of course, you're poorer than average, after all, you are the bottom 50%, but you're not hugely poorer than average. If your income share is only 5%, like in South Africa, it means your average income is only 1/10 of the average income of the total population. So, it makes an enormous difference. It also implies that if you're interested in poverty, you really need to look at the distribution, because, what this means is that for a given GDP per capita or average income, the average income of the bottom 50% can vary from a factor of 1 to 5, depending on whether your bottom 50% income share is 5% or 25%. So it's going to have tremendous implication on living standards, and this is why we should be interested in distribution. If you only look at aggregate GDP, that's not going to work. So this is for the distribution of income. And so, the short story is that there's been a movement toward more equality in the long run, but there are still, enormous variation across countries. Now, if we look at the distribution of wealth, what's really striking is that, inequality is pretty extreme everywhere. So, even in Europe, if you look, the bottom 50% share in wealth, right now in Europe is something like 4%. Which, okay, that's better than in Latin America, where it will be 1 or 2%, or in sub-Saharan Africa. But, 4% for 50% of the population, that's really very small. Now, there's been some progress in the long run, in the sense that, you can see this middle 40% now has a substantial share of total wealth in Europe, whereas a century ago, this middle 40% would have maybe 10% of total wealth and will be not very different from the bottom 50%. So, there's been some progress in the long run also for the distribution of wealth, but it is much more limited in the sense that, the top 10% always owns at least 60 and sometimes up to 80% of the total in all regions of the world. And the bottom 50%, always has less than 5%. So, that's why, in my book, I try to ask, okay, what can we make some progress in the long run about this? And, what I'm suggesting is that, we cannot just wait for, growth and market competition to lead to substantial progress, because, we've had growth and market competition for over 2 centuries, and clearly this was not enough to really spread the wealth to the bottom 50%. And so this is why, in my book, I talk about the possibility of a direct redistribution of inheritance, having a minimum inheritance for everyone, which will need to be substantial, if we want to make a difference. And I will return to that a bit later. Another dimension of inequality, which we also explore in a novel manner in the World Inequality Report 2022, is gender inequality. And so here we give a very simple but I think powerful indicator, which is the share of total labor income going to women. So if you wanted to have gender parity, it should be 50%. If you look at working time, and actually if you include domestic labor, women actually supply more than 50% of total working time in pretty much every country where we have a time use survey. You can see that, we're quite far from gender parity. So some countries have made progress. Some countries have actually gone down, like China, Russia. Generally speaking, communist countries had a somewhat higher share for women than non-communist countries. But then with the end of communism and in China with the market liberalization, the rise of inequality, in fact, the female share in some cases declined. In North America and Western Europe, it's going up, but it's still very, very far from 50%. So when you have 35% for women, it means men get 65%. And I think it's in a way this provides a clearer view of the big pictures, and when we just look at gender gap for a given occupation, because the thing is that women don't have access to the same occupation as men, and so this is a way to measure this, I think, in a clearer manner. And finally, the last big novelty of the World Inequality Report 2022 is to offer a new sort of worldview on the inequality of carbon emissions, not only between countries, but also within countries. So, of course, we are accustomed to look at carbon emission comparing countries, and, countries in the north have much bigger emissions than countries in the south who are going to suffer from the emissions of the north. But what's important also to realize is that there's also a lot of inequality within the south, within the north. So if you take the average for Europe, bottom 50% of Europeans today have an average carbon emission of about 5.1 ton per capita. That's including the carbon content of imports and everything. This is still too high. 5 ton, this should go toward 4 or 3 or 2, but this is not completely off the mark as compared to our objective for 2040 or 2050. The problem is that the top 10% has an average emission of 29.2 tons per capita, and in North America, it's over 70 tons. So the bottom line is that, it's going to be difficult to make progress and to reduce global carbon emission if you don't reduce inequality at the same time. It's going to be very difficult to convince people in the bottom 50% that they need to reduce their carbon emission if you don't ask people in the top 10%, not to mention the top 1%, or people who do space tourism and things like that, to reduce drastically their own emission. If the only solution you are proposing is a proportional reduction in carbon emission for everybody through a gigantic proportional carbon tax or increase in energy prices, which we sort of have today for other reasons, which we all know, I think this is going to create a lot of anger, in the middle class and the lower socioeconomic groups, and so I think then we have to invent a progressive carbon tax. You cannot treat in the same manner the first 3 or 4 tons of individual carbon emission and someone who has already emitted 100 tons or 50 tons. So, of course, people will always say, oh, that's complicated, progressive taxation, it's better to have a proportional tax. But, this was the same discussion a century ago at the time of discussing the introduction of a progressive income tax. And at the end, it was a very useful innovation. And, I think we are going to have to confront this same kind of innovation today. So, this was sort of the world tour of inequality in the world. And, I've already started to give you some insights about the book and the long-run perspective and the rise of equality, which I describe in this book. Let me get a little bit more into the details of the content of this book now. So this is a brief book. I should say, as compared to my previous books, this takes much less time to read. So, I have written 3 big books on the history of inequality in the past 20 years. The first one was published in 2001, so 21 years ago. The second one, Capital in the 21st Century, was published in 2013, and the last one, Capital and Ideology, in 2019. Now, each of these books is about 1,000 pages long, so that's 3,000 pages. So, please don't read them, unless you are really a very special interest in this topic. But, you can read this one, which is only 200 pages, which you can read in a weekend or so. And I should say the other books are easily readable as well. There's nothing technical, it can be read by anyone, but, of course, it takes a lot of time, and people have lots of other things to do in their life, and that's fine. This one, you will get sort of a synthesis of some of the main ideas. And also, I should say, I think it's a better book in the sense that by trying to be more synthetic and to summarize some of the main arguments, I think I have also come to clarify also for myself, some of, what are the main lessons in the end of what I have learned. And in particular, I have come with this conclusion that the main finding in the long run is that, despite the fact that we still live in a very unequal world, we have made collectively a lot of progress in the long run. And this long run movement toward more equality, both political equality, social equality, economic equality, has played an absolutely central role in the rise of modern economic prosperity as well. And this movement, could and should continue. Now, this movement did not happen naturally. It's not something that comes from the sky. It came through political mobilization, in some cases through major revolution and social struggles and transformation. Sometimes some of these struggles and revolutions, have not been terribly successful. And, the Bolshevik Revolution is an obvious example. But by and large, in the long run, if you take, this major revolution, struggles, political mobilization, have helped change the institution, social institution, fiscal institution, educational institution, electoral institution, in such a manner as to make the world more equal and also more prosperous. And this is the history that I'm trying to tell in this book. So, it's a short book, but it still has about 10 chapters. It has exactly 10 chapters. So each chapter is about 20 pages long, 25 pages long. So, I start with a sort of long-run perspective about the movement toward more equality, in particular the slow deconcentration of power and property. Then there are several chapters on the heritage of slavery, colonialism, the question of reparation, which I'm not going to talk about right now, but I'd be happy to answer questions if you have. Then I talk about what I refer to here as the Great Redistribution, between 1914 and 1980, where you have an acceleration in the compression of inequality. And in the final chapter of the book, I talk about sort of a new perspective for the future with a new form of what I refer to as participatory socialism and based on a sort of permanent redistribution of wealth and a more equal sharing of power in social and economic power in society in general, and in particular power in companies. So I'm going to cover all of this material pretty fast. Let me start with, again, the long-run evolution of the concentration of wealth. So this is what we have for France, but I should say, we have very similar data for Britain, for Sweden, for all countries for which we have very long-run data on wealth concentration. And the findings, I already sort of summarized some of the main findings earlier, is that in the long run, there is a limited rise of more equality, in the sense that if you look at the share of the top 10%, it used to be 80–90% in the 19th century. Now it's 50 to 60%. It has increased a little bit since the 1980s, but in the long run, it is still much smaller today than what it was. So that's the good news. You can see the rise of the, this middle 40%, which used to own very little, and now owns about 40% of total wealth. So if you are 40% of the population, you own 40% of total wealth, it means that on average you have about the average wealth, which will be, in France today, just to put numbers, this will be about 200,000 euros per adult. So this will be individuals who own anywhere between 100, 200, 300 per adult. So these are people, who are not hugely rich as compared to millionaires or billionaires, but they are very far from being completely poor. And this is a major historical transformation, that you have this group who own collectively 40% of total wealth rather than 10%. That's a major transformation. And the question, is how can we move further in this direction? Because you can see that, in the recent decades, there's actually been a little decline in the middle class share of total wealth. In the US, the decline is even bigger, and the rise of the top 10% even larger. And in any case, both in Europe and in the US, you can see that the bottom 50% is incredibly small. It's like 4 or 5% in France today. Okay, it was 2% in the 19th century, so you can say it's an improvement, but basically that's very little. Now, why is this important? Because wealth, in a way, it's even more important than income, or well, let's say both are very important, but wealth, in a way, it's also a measure of your bargaining power in society. Because if you have zero wealth, or even worse, if you have negative wealth, if you only have debt, basically you are in a very weak bargaining position vis-a-vis your own life and vis-a-vis the rest of society. Because if you have zero wealth and you have a family to take care of, you have to accept any job, any working condition, any wage, because you need to pay for your rent and you need to pay for your family. Now, if you have just 100,000 euros, 200,000 euros, this may seem very small for billionaires or millionaires, but in fact, it's very different from zero, because it means you can start to negotiate with the rest of the world. So, you don't like this job, you can wait a little bit. Maybe you can create your own firm. Maybe you can build a house for your family. I think it makes, in the end, a better society. A society where everybody has a little bit of wealth. It's a society where you have more initiative, more dynamism. And I think in the long run, the fact that we now have this middle class with a substantial share in wealth, has been a huge progress. And, a century ago, in 1910, of course, people at the top, just like today, were saying that, no, it's impossible to redistribute wealth. If you redistribute the wealth away from us, the sky is going to fall and the world is going to disappear and growth is going to disappear and innovation is going to disappear. Well, this is not what happened. There was a huge redistribution of wealth, sometimes through major drama and catastrophe, including World War I and World War II. Sometimes, in the long run, through more sort of positive institution building, welfare state, progressive taxation. But in the end, this worked very well. And if anything, we had much faster economic growth and productivity growth in the 20th century than ever before, because this enormous inequality of the 19th century and concentration of power and concentration of wealth was not necessary. I'm not saying you want complete equality, but the historical evidence is that having a more inclusive distribution of economic power is actually good for economic growth. So that's the first point I wanted to stress. The other point is that, okay, before World War I, pretty much every country in Europe was incredibly unequal. So here we have France. In Britain, it was even more extreme. Sweden, I already mentioned, was sort of in between France and Britain. So, before World War I, you had extreme concentration of wealth. And I would say, that the extreme inequality of the time also, not only was not necessary for growth and prosperity, but I think also contributed to to the social tension and to some extent to the nationalist tension, which led to World War One. You had all this competition between colonial power and in particular top wealth owners about investing in new colonies, new territories, etc. So I think in many ways this was not a very good equilibrium, and I'm afraid that today we might have some of this problem as well. Now, in the long run, as you can see, the kind of progress we have made, if you compare Europe 1930 and Europe 2020, now you can see the US 2020 sort of in between Europe 1913 and Europe 2020, and in a way is going back toward Europe 1913 in terms of wealth concentration, although, it's still much more equal than Europe 1913, but less equal, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the US were closer to the Europe today. And so, they are moving in the direction of shrinking share for the middle 40%, which, I think is not good. And it's creating a lot of frustration, economic frustration, which then some politicians are trying to use, they are trying to exploit this frustration to find some, other people who are responsible for that. It could be China, it could be Latino migrants, it could be Muslim, it could be, you can always find lots of people who are responsible for your problem. But I think in the end, the problem is more a domestic problem of how you build more inclusive society. So historically, how did we make progress? Well, let me say, that probably the most important and sort of deepest transformation is summarized here, which is what we can call the rise of the welfare state or social state in Europe. So here, this is an average of Germany, France, Britain, and Sweden. There are variations across these countries, but by and large, this is a big picture. So basically, before World War One, total tax revenue were very, very small. Less than 10%, and most of the tax revenue were financing the army, the police, the colonial expansion, law and order. Very little social spending. In particular, education spending was very small. In Europe before World War I, it was less than 0.5% of national income for education. And then it was multiplied by 10 over the course of the 20th century, and now it's 5 to 6% of national income. So it went from 0.5% of national income to more than 5% of national income. I think this is a typical social spending which has contributed, to create both more equality and more prosperity, because this is what has allowed us to move from a very elitist education system to a much more inclusive educational system, and has contributed to increase productivity a lot. Now you can see the stagnation of total educational investment in recent decades. This is because total tax revenue have sort of stabilized in recent decades, and because you keep, you still have a small increase in total health spending and pension spending, which are very difficult to stabilize given the aging of the population. You actually reduce a little bit education spending, which is very paradoxical because, of course, the fraction of a generation going to higher education has increased a lot in recent decades, which means that the per capita investment has declined relatively to per capita national income, which I think is not good in the long run. And if you want to understand the slowdown of economic growth and productivity growth, I think this is probably the most obvious explanation. This stagnation of total educational investment. And I think ideally we should continue this historical process of more educational investment, and more generally, this gradual process of sort of decommodification of the economy, where we have entire sectors, starting with education and health, and to some extent transportation, infrastructure, energy, culture, to some extent, which are sort of outside the market, and which in the end, have been working very well in the long run. If you look today at countries with private sector, dominant position of the private sector in health like the US. If you look at public health indicators, they are simply not good at all. I mean, I know some people believe they are very good in the US, but if you look at the data, it's hard to say that all this money is working very well. So, I think it's not only about more equality and more prosperity, it's also through a different form of economic organization. And, I think this long run movement, could and should continue. Now, this would require more social justice and fiscal justice in the distribution of the tax burden. And so this is the second point I would like to make now, is that this rise of the welfare state historically was made possible because between 1910 and 1980, you also had a very big rise of progressive taxation, which made the general rise of taxation more acceptable for the middle class and the lower socioeconomic groups. Of course, everybody had to pay more tax. You cannot pay for a welfare state like this just by taxing the rich. Everybody has to pay. But if you want the middle class to accept to pay high level of taxation, you want to make sure, you want to convince them that people at the top are paying at least as much as they do. Otherwise, who is going to accept to pay more tax? And I think this is the problem we have today. And whereas in over this period, between 1910 and 1980, you had very progressive taxation. So this is a quick summary of the history of progressive taxation over this period. So, if the bottom line is that if you take a country like the United States, which was the economic leader of the world for basically all of the 20th century, the top income tax rate was over 90%, under Roosevelt, but more generally, if you take between 1930 and 1980, the average in the US was 81%. It was sometimes it was 90, sometimes it was 70. So on average, it was 81%. Now, of course, this applied only to very high income levels. But the point is that this did not destroy US capitalism. Otherwise we would have noticed it. And in fact, if anything, this was a period of maximum prosperity of the US economy, maximum economic advance over the rest of the world. Why is it so? Well, because, I think the true source of economic prosperity, again, is much more, education than inequality. And in the middle of the 20th century, the thing is that the US as a country, had an enormous advance in terms of education over the rest of the world. So, in the 1950s, if you look at, you have 90% of a generation going to high school in the US. At the same time, it is only 20 or 30% in Germany or France or Japan. And, you have to wait until the 1980s, 1990s to get this kind of universal access to higher education. And I think, this is the reason why the US was so productive as an economy in the middle of the 20th century. And the fact that you have more inequality in itself. So, Reagan in the 1980s told its population, okay, we are going to divide by 2 the top income tax rate, and we are going to get more innovation and more growth. But in fact, that's not what they got, because, I think, I'm not saying you want complete equality. You probably need some inequality to get incentives, and then you can discuss, should we have an income gap of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 20? I think 1 to 5, 1 to 10 is sufficient from my analysis of the historical evidence and comparative evidence between countries. But in any case, 1 to 50 or 1 to 100 or 1 to 200 is simply not necessary. If you look at this time period in the middle of the 20th century, where these enormous income gaps were shrink enormously, there was no damage to economic growth after the war. This is simply not true. If you look, so that's for the case of the US. So, here I compare the evolution of the growth rate of national income per capita in the US and the top income tax rate in red. So you can see when very high progressive taxation was introduced in between 1910 and 1990, the growth rate basically did not change. In fact, the only time where the growth rate really changed is in the past 30 years after this enormous decline in the top tax rate by Reagan, which was supposed to boost economic growth. In fact, the growth rate was divided by 2. So, by the way, I'm not saying the growth rate was divided by 2 because the top income tax rate was divided by 2. I think the main explanation for the division by 2 of the growth rate is, as I already said, the stagnation of educational investment. But in any case, what this shows, and what we should all agree upon, is that this division by 2 of the top income tax rate, did not boost economic growth, and in itself, is not. And I think it's really important to change the narrative about this. And I think the historical experience with very high progressive taxation of income, including 80–90% top income tax rate, is actually very positive if you put them at very high income levels. And I think it's time to return to this experience. Now, how can we move in the future, and how can we go further in the future? And I'm going to conclude there. In the kind of perspective for participatory socialism in the 21st century that I describe at the end of my book, which is a sort of, and you can also call it social democracy for the 21st century if you prefer. But basically, what I propose to do is to start from the sort of social democratic achievement of the 20th century, including the welfare state, progressive taxation of income, etc., and try to move further. In particular, I try to move further in 2 main directions. One is the redistribution of inheritance, and the other one is the more inclusive sharing of power in corporations. Let me start with redistribution of inheritance. Here, it's a simple proposal where everybody at age 25 will get the equivalent of a minimum inheritance, equal to 60% of average inheritance. So in the context of France or Western Europe today, that will be about 120,000 euros, because the average wealth per adult is about 200,000 euros. Now, this will mean that the bottom 50% of children who today receive about 0, very close to 0, would receive 120,000. This will be paid by progressive taxation on inheritance and annual progressive tax on wealth. So typically, the people in the top 10% who today receive 1 million, they would receive only 600,000. Now, as you can see, there will still be enormous inequality of opportunity between the bottom 50% children and top 10% children. And, if you want my opinion, I think we could go much further than this. But, what I find striking is that when you make this kind of proposal, many people who pretend to be in favor of equality of opportunity, you make a proposal that is trying to move a little bit toward equality of opportunity, and they start, being very worried, what, these poor children, what are they going to do with the money, but as if, rich children were always doing very clever things with the money they receive. And so, we can put restrictions on what people do with the money, but it should also apply to rich children and not only to poor children. In any case, I'm not saying this is going to happen next week, but I'm saying, if you look at the enormous transformation which have already happened over the past century, we already have a minimum income scheme in many countries. This will not come in substitution to the welfare state or to minimum income. This will be a new step which will come in addition to all these other steps. And I think this will make an enormous difference for the reason I explained before about the distribution of power. So I'm not saying this will happen next week, but I think if we are looking for some kind of long-run objective and a kind of transformation that would be comparable in magnitude to the transformations that happened during the 20th century, that's a possibility. The other major transformation I analyze in my book is what I call here participatory socialism and power sharing. And basically, as you can see on this graph, the idea will be that as the number of employees in the firm, as the size of the firm gets larger, the share of voting rights which will be obtained by a single shareholder, which will decline. So basically, if you're a single shareholder and you are in a small company, okay, you have more than 50% of voting rights. As the company gets larger, you lose the majority of voting rights, because basically you need to discuss, you need to have a discussion, you need to convince at least a fraction of your employees about what you're going to do. So in effect, technically, this is an extension of what already exists. There is a number of countries, including Germany and Sweden, where workers' representatives already have, up to 50% of voting rights to choose board representatives. So they choose up to 50% of the board members of a company, which is already quite an important transformation, because it means, so this only applies to the larger company, over 1,000 workers in Germany, but this is already a major transformation, because this means that if you can convince a minority of shareholders to side with you, then you can, shift the majority, even with a shareholder who was 80 or 90% of the shares, which, from a point of view of a US capitalist or a British capitalist or a French capitalist, is almost like communism, except that, it's been like that in Germany and Sweden for more than half a century. And, I think it has allowed to involve workers in the long-run strategy of company in a way that has been quite successful. So here, this is a simple extension of this, with an extension to all firms, small or large, and the additional rule that within the 50% of voting rights going to shareholders, there will be a maximum that a single shareholder can have, which will depend on the size of the company. So again, it's like with the redistribution of inheritance, I'm not saying this is going to happen next week. This will require an enormous political battle, but from the evidence we have, from the historical evidence we have, first, I think this will be a desirable transformation. And secondly, I think this is doable in the long run, in the sense that, this is not a more fundamental transformation than the similar transformations that already took place in the past. I'm going to stop there. Thanks a lot for your attention. The general conclusion is, look at history, look at the economic history of the world, and I think there are lots of optimistic and positive lessons to be drawn for the future. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for your interesting talk. I learned a lot myself, and of course we have time for a few questions. Let me start with the first question while others type in their questions. So I mentioned that I work as a researcher at the WHO Council for the Economics for Health for All. It's led by Mariana Mazzucato, and the council aim is to redirect sort of the economy towards health for all. You mentioned that education expenditures has stagnated, and that's kind of one of the problems with these recent changes. What can you say about the role of health expenditures, right? How is, for example, universal health coverage, how is it related to income inequality? Is there a link, right? If we fix, for example, if we provide health for all, will it help us to reduce income inequality? Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I put more emphasis on education during my presentation, but education and health are sort of the twin, the twin sisters or twin brothers of, social progress. And for different reasons. And for education, having a good health is central, to be able to have a good job and a good work and a good life, just in terms of welfare. So, health and education have also a value, just as a consumption good, if you want to speak like an economist, but I would say more in terms of just improving your own capability. And, it's part of the ultimate objective of civilization. And so it has a value in itself. And in addition, it also has an instrumental value for, participation to the labor force and more economic equality. So, the two are absolutely central. And, in the long run, education and health are already, enormous economic sectors, much bigger than the automobile industry or whatever. And, they should become even bigger, in the future. I think, in 50 years, health could be 20% or 25% of national income, and education could be 10 or 15%. And, that would be fantastic. We just need to organize a distribution of income and wealth and economic power that comes with this.
Okay, great. So we have a question from the audience. So we have a question from Lina Zadorozhnya, and her question is, what level of redistribution of the wealth should be expected in Ukraine due to the war? Again, I don't know how much you know about Ukraine, but in case you can comment, it would be great.
Yeah, well, I don't think we should expect too many good things from the war. That's the first thing I would like to say is, wars are always bad, and the war in Ukraine, is no exception, and it's particularly bad. So, the views that I hear sometimes about the history of equality, which, we need wars like World War I, World War II to redistribute wealth, I don't believe in that. I think wars can lead to political monsters. We've seen that between World War I and World War II in Europe. We can also have monsters without wars. We see that right now. But, in any case, what matters for the long run distribution of wealth is, more, the redistribution of inheritance, the progressive taxation of wealth. And, I think a problem in Ukraine, but also, in all over the world, in Russia, but also in Western Europe, is that, the rise of modern oligarchs, has a lot to do with a tax system that is in effect allowing oligarchs, to get away without paying any tax. And here I really want to stress this. It's not enough to have an income tax. You need a wealth tax. There was a very interesting, and it's not only in Ukraine, or, it's also in the US, in Germany, everywhere. There was a disclosure last year by news website in the US, which showed, the income tax return, the federal income tax return of the US of the top 100 billionaires, Jeff Bezos, etc. And they looked at the past 10 years. And basically, if you look at the increase of the wealth of these top 100 billionaires, and you compare to how much income tax they paid over these past 10 years, the total income tax rate was, less than 5%, 3-4%, as compared to the increase in the wealth of these people. So, of course, if you only pay 3 or 4% income tax, it's easier to get rich than, if the middle class is paying 30% or 40% or 50%. And the explanation is because when you're very wealthy, the notion of income is actually difficult to define, because you don't need this income for yourself. You accumulate the profits into a particular legal entity, which can be a holding, a foundation, your own firm, etc. So you really need to tax the wealth itself. You really need to have a progressive tax on the wealth itself. And so that, I think that's what's important if we want to reduce the power of oligarchs in Ukraine or all over the world.
I think it's interesting how we teach, like this, because usually a lot of economics we teach in macroeconomics, that Chumley paper 1986, you should not tax capital, and it's sort of in our brains that don't touch, capital, don't touch wealth. So we have to change this, right? Because you have to look at this from the equality perspective. So we have 3 more questions. Again, let's try to answer all of them. So first question is, it's about current education, what skills to acquire. Let me maybe ask all of them, and then Yeah. So first question is what skills to acquire. Second question, what distribution of wealth is desirable, normal or uniform? And finally, did the existence of USSR influence the attitude of European countries and USA towards equality, and particularly progressive taxation? Yeah, thank you.
So these are a small question, easy to answer. Now, look, these are very important and interesting questions. Let me start from the end. The USSR, I think, the existence of a communist counter model, played an important role in so many different ways, in the 20th century. So, it had lots of negative consequences for people living in the USSR, although, as compared to the Tsarist regime before the revolution, there were also some improvements, including in education and health. But, of course, there were lots of negative consequences for people living in the USSR. Now, for people outside the USSR, people in the West, I think the USSR certainly contributed to put pressure on the elite of Western countries, to accept a number of fiscal and social reform, which otherwise would have been difficult to accept. It also had huge influence on, the fact that in the US, the Democratic Party, which was the party of racial segregation, suddenly turned to the civic rights movement in the 1960s because, in the context of decolonization and the Cold War, it was very difficult to be openly racist in the 50s, 60s. It was beginning to become very costly, politically at least. And so, the existence of a communist counter model, certainly put pressure on this. Now, I would not say this was the decisive factor. I think in the end, it certainly accelerated certain changes, but I think the domestic factors, the building of, if you take the example of Sweden I mentioned, the key factor was how the Social Democratic Party, the trade union movement basically took power through elections. And, the existence of a Bolshevik counter model, the other side of the frontier, the other side of the sea, frankly, this was not the most decisive factor. So we should not exaggerate it. Now, if we look at the future, I think the lesson is, the first factor to reduce inequality is collective mobilization. So we need some new form of, social democratic parties, trade union platform to reduce inequality. Now, geopolitical competition, like the one with the Soviet Union in the 20th century, can also play a role. And for the 21st century, of course, the competition is going to be with China. And, I think the existence of the Chinese counter model, could also, like the Soviet Union in the 20th century, play a role to force Western countries in particular, to offer something better, to offer, I hope, some form of more democratic socialism, very different from the kind of authoritarian, repressive socialism. Well, this is the way they call it in China, which they have to offer. And in particular, in terms of influence in the global south, in the rest of the world, that's going to be key. And, this could contribute to Western countries moving away to the sort of hyper-capitalist ideology. Although, at this stage, I'm not, I don't see as much of that than I would like to see. Regarding the proper level of wealth. So I don't know. The question was about
what skills? So there was a question about skills. There was a question what kind of wealth distribution is desirable, bell-shaped, but it cannot be bell-shaped. It will be anyway or uniform. So these two, and there is actually one more. If you have maybe a minute, then there is a final question.
Oh well, tell me the final question, and I can answer all of them.
So the final question is, what is active redistribution policy relevant for developing economies like Ukraine? Would not it undermine gross capital formation, right? So we have here somebody who believes in Chumley 1986. So
no, let me answer all of this together. I think that both for Ukraine and for every country in the world, the true source of prosperity is more, education, human capital than wealth concentration and wealth inequality. And I think, I'm not saying you want complete equality. So, I think in terms of income, you may want to have income gaps of, 1 to 5, 1 to 10. In terms of wealth, they have to be bigger than that. But, typically, I think the best possible society will be a society where, everybody, if average wealth is, say, 200,000 euros, everybody would have, at least 100. Many people would have 200. Some people would have 500, a million. Maybe some people would have a few dozen million, but they will return pretty quickly towards the average. And I don't think billionaires are useful in any meaningful way. I think if you look at if you compare different historical period between them, the fact that you have more billionaires, is not helping you in terms of economic growth and innovation. In fact, if anything, it leads to a concentration of economic power, which limits the possibility for other people to join the economic game and to bring their own ideas and innovation. So, that's now. from a single country perspective, of course, it's not always easy to make this kind of change. And so, I'm not trying to give lessons to anybody or government, and I can see why single country can take different route, but through international cooperation, and in some cases through some form of capital control, you can go in this direction. I think the idea, I think that's important also for Ukraine in the future, but that's important also for the European Union in the future. The idea is that you can have completely free capital flow without any common taxation and common contribution to the financing of the public goods and infrastructure through which people can become rich. Is completely crazy, and this will have to be changed. I think in Ukraine, in Europe, in the world, especially as we tackle new challenges to address global warming, global inequality, and new investment in skills. As one of the questions mentioned, I think the big challenge is how we live in a world where in many countries now we have more than 50% of a generation going to higher education, and in some countries it's already 60, 70, 80, which is an incredible progress in the long run, but it creates an incredibly new challenge, which is how you offer opportunities in higher education, which cannot be exactly the same for everyone. It's not like in primary or secondary education where you want to bring everybody exactly or almost exactly to the same common level. Here you have to accept some form of diversity, but at the same time, this cannot be an excuse for the kind of enormous inequality in resources, educational resources, which we see today. So that's really the new challenge, is to define a sort of new norm of educational justice, so to speak, in this new era.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, for your excellent talk, for these important questions which we all care about, like equality and poverty and wealth taxation. So we wish you to have great success with your future books, right? And we hope to see you maybe sometime soon. And to people who could not watch it because of blackout, this video will be available on YouTube. So let's thank once again Thomas Piketty for his time today, and let's finish this, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And
bye-bye.
Hope to see you in Ukraine. Not too far.
Great. Yeah, sure. Please come after our victory. Right?